La bûche de Noël. You've probably heard of it before. It's a traditional French Christmas dessert shaped, yes, like a log. And I guess that might be kind of strange to us here in the United States. It's kind of like, hey, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, here's your log. But the bûche de Noël is full of rich history and symbolism, and it has some pretty interesting stories attached to it. It's not just another cake, it is the cake, as in the iconic French Christmas cake. So the bûche de Noël is shaped like a Yule log, right? Okay, so like the log that you put on the fire in your fireplace at Christmas time. Why is it so important? Well, here's where it came from. The Yule log came from the ancient Celtic tradition of celebrating the winter solstice by locating and retrieving an enormous tree trunk, often with the roots still attached, and burning it on the shortest day of the year. This act was a way to celebrate the rebirth of the sun, as well as to give thanks for the warmth and life it would bring. The Celts believed that certain trees, specifically oak, beech, elm, and cherry trees, had certain mystical powers. So they would often use a part of the log to make a wedge for the plow as good luck for the next year's harvest. The earliest Yule log in France can be traced back to Celtic Brittany. The French bûche de Noël tradition is actually believed to have stemmed from a medieval feudal tax taken at Christmas times called the right of the log. You know, remember back with feudal lords where they owned all this land, it would rent it out to the poor peasants who and then make them also pay taxes and give them things. Well, yep, okay, this was part of that. So the peasants were required to bring a large piece of wood to the feudal lord's house around Christmas time. And then years later, the peasants started doing it at their own homes. They would bless the log, decorate it with ribbons and greenery, and sometimes sprinkle salt, oil, or wine on it before burning it for several days. Now, in the 12th century, the ceremony became more elaborate. Families would haul home enormous logs, and in some regions, the youngest child was allowed to even ride home on the log. As families dragged their logs home, passers-by would raise their hats because they knew that the log was full of good promises and that its flames would burn out old wrongs. Now, in France, there were different bûche de Noël traditions throughout the country. In the south, in Provence, the charred remains of the previous year's bûche de Noël was relit as a starter for the new year or for the new log. The family would then gather around the hearth and say a prayer. In Bretagne, the oldest and youngest members of the family would light the log together and say a prayer to the bébé Jésus. And in Bourgogne, they tended to get larger logs than most. And while children said their prayers in another room, parents would hide small gifts under the log, such as nuts, dried fruit, and coins. When the children were done with their prayers, they would come back into the room with their parents, and they would use sticks to roll the log away and to get the gifts out from underneath it. People would also use the log as a way to predict events in the upcoming year. They would hit the burning log with tongs, and the embers emitted would tell them what the harvest would be like. For example, the more embers, the more corn. The fire was read and predictions were made for the coming year based on the sparks and the flames that they saw. For instance, how many chickens or calves would be born, marriages in the family, health or wealth, etc. But if the fire cast shadows on the wall, there would be a death in the family that year. So since when do flames not produce shadows? That must have been kind of grim. Anywho, the remaining cinders would be placed in the soil so that they would prevent crop diseases and produce a good harvest. Also, people used to use the remaining cinders or ashes from Yule logs to spread around chicken coops to keep away foxes, and in barns and lofts where corn was stored to keep rats and weevils away. Supposedly, during a storm, throwing a handful of the Yule log ashes into the fire would keep the house safe from lightning. The ashes of the Yule log were believed to hold magical and medicinal powers that would ward off evil spirits for the coming year. So the custom of burning the Yule log continued in France and Quebec until the late 1800s. However, hearths eventually got smaller and turned to stoves, and the Yule log turned into a small branch placed in the center of the Christmas table. It was normally surrounded by friandises, or little sweets and delicacies that were given to guests as treats. So the bûche de Noël has a very long history in France. Now, there are a couple of stories about where the cake bûche de Noël actually originated. One was that the Yule log was supposed to burn for the entire evening, or a minimum of 12 hours. And since logs didn't always burn that long, the story goes that the cake was invented as a way to stretch it out. Of course, that would definitely not work in my household, because is a cake going to sit there for 12 hours while I'm around? Absolutely not. It'll be gone within like 60 minutes. But anywho, there's also the more reasonable story that the cake came into being because houses were no longer being built with fireplaces, so there was nowhere to burn an actual log. But maybe one of the wackiest stories has to do with Napoleon I. Supposedly, during his reign, Napoleon realized that there was a lot of disease in Paris. And one of his solutions was to mandate that all chimneys must remain closed during the winter months, because he thought that the cold, drafty air was causing all of this illness. So with chimneys closed, there was no way for air to get in or for people to burn the bûche de Noël. So supposedly a Parisian baker got creative and invented the cake as a symbolic alternative to burning the actual Yule log. But whatever the reason, we do know that the cake dates back to the Victorian era, sometime after 1870. The earliest recipe is in a cookbook called Le Mémorial historique et géographique de la pâtisserie by a Parisian pastry chef, Pierre Lacam, which was published in 1898. The recipe he gives is for biscuit, what they used to call sponge cake, rolled with either chocolate or buttercream frosting. The earliest recipe that most resembles today's bûche de Noël recipes was done by Joseph Fabre in 1905, and it was published in the second edition of his book Dictionnaire universel de cuisine pratique. The cake is most popular today in Quebec, Belgium, and France, although some American families are also partaking in the tradition. The bûche de Noël uses a genoise sponge cake, or a moist, rich yellow cake. And it's baked in a flat jelly roll pan, or a cookie sheet with raised edges. Once the cake has been cooked, it is flipped out onto a kitchen towel sprinkled with flour, and then it is immediately rolled up into a cylinder. This helps the cake to retain that shape. While you let it cool, you can then work on making the filling and the frosting. Traditionally, the filling is a chocolate and the frosting is a buttercream, but today flavors and fillings vary from region to region. The most common is a chocolate buttercream, but you can pretty much do whatever you want with the filling and the frosting these days. So after you have your filling and your frosting made, you unroll the cake, you put your filling on just one side of it, and then you roll it back up, and you should have a cylinder that looks like this, and on the end of it, you can see this nice swirl with the cake and the filling. And after that, you then get to ice it traditionally with buttercream frosting, which is a really nice thing to get to do because if your cake accidentally cracks while you're rolling it or unrolling it and then re-rolling it again, hey, guess what? It doesn't really matter because you can then just put frosting on top of it to cover up the cracks. Woohoo! So after you frost it, you then can decorate it however you would like. But of course, the most traditional decorations include things like powdered sugar for snow, some cocoa powder around it for dirt, these little meringue mushrooms, almond pine cones, and things like that. So this is a very traditional bûche de Noël cake right here, like that you would imagine, supposed to be like something you would imagine stumbling upon if you were out walking through the forest, right? Now, in recent years, however, the bûche de Noël, they have changed quite a bit. Decorations and shapes, as well as textures have been altered. Flavors have become lighter and fruitier, and the colors have changed as well. This is particularly common in Paris, where pastry making is not just an art, it's also almost its own fashion industry. As a pastry chef in Paris, if you're not making something innovative, then you're not excelling. So one recent example of a very creative bûche de Noël was done by the celebrated pastry chef Christophe Michalek of the Hotel Plaza Athénée. And this was modeled after the hotel's cascading staircase. Even Kentucky Fried Chicken once used the bûche de Noël as part of their advertising to promote their crispy chicken. Supposedly it was, crisped fireside by their, bûche de Noël, right? Now, this was Madame's most recent attempt at a bûche de Noël. I've been making bûche de Noël for many, many years, but this was one that I made from a few years ago. I was inspired by one of the contestants on the Great British Baking Show. So if you're interested and you have Netflix, the Great British Baking Show, the holiday edition, season 1, episode 1, the very first challenge they give them is to make a bûche de Noël. And one of the contestants made one that was very chocolatey and it had a sleigh with reindeer on top. So this was my recreation of it, which, yeah, not too bad. I was kind of okay with how it came out. Looked pretty okay. However, if I was on the show, I sadly would not have won because from taking my bûche de Noël from here in the kitchen out to the dining room table, my poor little reindeer kind of lost their antlers a little bit. But didn't matter because the cake was still delicious. We ate it all up and loved it, and it was fun to make it. Anywho, so whatever the style of a bûche de Noël, it is something that is definitely very traditional, very iconic in France, and it's very fun to make and decorate it however you would like. So I would definitely encourage everybody to this holiday season or next or sometime in the future, try to make your own bûche de Noël.